Tweeted out that it was one of the high points of his life that burglars were now afraid to burgle houses on Christmas after his movie. So, if you've ever seen that movie. There was a little mix-up in the scriptures that were going to be in the bulletin. I'm actually going to be talking about Revelation chapter 12. Yeah, wow, Revelation's okay. And it's a little quirk that I have. It's my favorite Christmas story in the Bible, Revelations 12. Some people say that John, who wrote the Gospel of John, and oddly enough, Revelation, doesn't have a Christmas story, but there is a Christmas story in Revelation chapter 12 that John wrote. So I'm going to look at that a little bit today. Every year, I'm sort of accused of being a Scrooge about this time of the year. And I feel like I have to defend myself somewhat from that. I mean, I love giving and receiving gifts, and I love gatherings with family and friends. I'm not opposed at all to merrymaking. I love merrymaking whenever I get the chance. I love Christmas trees and lights. You know, I love the way the house looks, even though I don't take much part in actually making it look that way. I love the way the house looks at Christmas. I love the way churches look at Christmas. You know, they always come out with Christmas trees and lights and poinsettias, and it's like I think the sanctuary never looks better than it does around Christmas time. So I'm not against any of that, really. What I'm against is this confusion of a sort of a cultural, economic holiday with the holy day that Christians celebrate as Christmas. And that confusion, I think, helps explain some of what people talk about when they refer to the so-called war on Christmas. Has anybody heard of the war on Christmas lately? Somebody said earlier this year in Advent, I'm not going to name any people, but somebody who works in Washington said something about now the war on Christmas is over and you can say Merry Christmas. And it's if you think that there is a so-called war on Christmas, it's good that you're here today, because there has not been since colonial times, oddly enough. There has not been a war on Christmas. The Pilgrims, when they first came over here, one of the first things that they did was outlaw the celebration of Christmas. And if you want to know why they did that, there's a long theological explanation that I'll tell you about afterwards over cookies. But the point is, there was a war on Christmas in this country, but it was at the founding of the country, and it lasted for quite a long time, until 1870, when Christmas was actually made a national holiday by the federal government. But the point is, because of that, when people talk about the war on Christmas, it's a fake idea. It's just meant to stir people up and get them thinking about, Christmas and political ideas and so on. But there is no war on Christmas, except in Revelation 12. Oddly enough, Christmas is shown to be a time of difficulty and tension. So I'm going to look at Revelation 12. Does anybody remember just a couple weeks ago, there was a young American missionary that went to an island off the coast of India and was killed, got off the boat, and, Now there's a Christmas story for you. You'll see that in the book of Revelation, but that's the kind of thing that Christians are into. We're born into, if you're a Christian, you're born into a struggle that's going on in between God and God's kingdom and the kingdoms of this world. And Christians are in that struggle. And that's where I think the real war on Christmas is. So let's look at the book of Revelation, chapter 12. And before I read it for you, I have to say a word about dreams and visions and apocalyptic literature. Anybody remember a dream that they had recently, or maybe even last night? You know how oh, you did. Tell us about your dream. No, I'm just kidding. Dreams can be quite embarrassing sometimes. But you know how dreams are. you're having a dream and you can be in a situation with people, and then the dream will change, and you'll be in a different situation with the same people, and then it'll osmose into something else. And it's hard to it's like figuring out dreams is like trying to hold Jell-O in your hands. They're hard to get a hold of. And visions and so on in apocalyptic literature, which is what Revelation is, are the same kind of thing. They're highly symbolic. In fact, if you ever have looked at a book on how to interpret dreams, you'll find a lot of symbolism talked about. That's the way apocalyptic literature is. It's symbolic, scenes osmose from one into the other, and there's lots of ways of looking at that. In the book of Revelation, one of the chief things that you can do, and I'm not going to give you a whole talk on how to interpret Revelation. You can turn on your television when you get home and see that from a number of people. But here's one thing that I would say. One of the ways that you can help yourself if you're reading the book of Revelation is look at the whole rest of the Bible for the symbols, because all of the symbols in the book of Revelation are used somewhere in the Old Testament. And we're going to see that in a second. So, having said all that about Revelation and the symbolism there and the dreams and visions and apocalyptic aspect of it, here is Revelations chapter 12. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child. There you go. And she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon. Have the kids gone? Okay, good. This is one of those things that I think people, the rabbis wouldn't let their children read till they got to be a certain age. Another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on those heads were 7 crowns. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. Merry Christmas. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who was to rule the nations with the rod of iron. Those of you who have read Psalm 2 know exactly what that's about. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared for her by God, so that there she might be nourished for 1,260 days. And there was a war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels waged war. And they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their life, even unto death. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and to the sea, because the devil has come down to you with great wrath, knowing that he only has a short time. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. And the 2 wings of a great eagle were given to the woman. And I will lift you up on eagle's wings. Does that sound familiar from Isaiah 40? And that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time, a times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And the serpent poured out water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. And the earth helped the woman. Mother Earth helped the woman. And the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Okay, so do you hear Christmas in there? You will in a minute. I want to look at that a little bit. And how do we understand something like that? In the first place, I think the best thing to do is start with the characters. So the characters in this story are the woman. Notice that the woman is clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a 12-star crown on her head. Does that remind anybody of anything you've read in the Old Testament before? Genesis 37. Joseph has a dream that his brothers get angry about him for. And do you remember what the part of his dream was? I should just read it to you because it's only a verse. But it's exactly what's going on here. Genesis 37:9. Now Joseph had another dream, and it related to his brothers. And he said, "Lo, there's another Christmas word, right? Lo. I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." And they took that, the brothers did, as, hey, he's saying that we, all of us, the family of Jacob, Israel, are going to be bowing down to him. And the point is that this vision of the woman who has the sun and the moon and the 12-star crown represents, in a general way, the people of Israel, the people of God, from whom the Messiah was going to come. So you have to back up now and take a bird's eye view of this woman and think she's not a particular person. She represents the people of God in general, Israel. She also represents, in a way, Mary, because Mary's the one who was pregnant with the boy child who was going to be the king and so on, the one who's going to rule with the iron scepter. So the woman represents faithful Israel in general, the people of God in general, also Mary, the mother of Jesus. And at the end of the vision, because the vision sort of repeats itself and osmosis into another segment of it, she also represents the mother of all of the people who follow Jesus. And where did Christians come from? We came out of the Jewish people. So the dragon gets enraged with the woman whom he can't, get to, and so he goes off to make war with the rest of the offspring of the woman, namely Christians. Okay, so there's the woman. Then you've got the child that's born, the one that was going to rule with an iron scepter. That's obviously Jesus. But notice that he doesn't figure into this story too much. He's caught up to God. And so he's, in the story, he's born, he escapes the dragon's nefarious plans, and he's taken up to heaven. So his whole life, Jesus' whole life in this vision is taken up in less than a half a verse. And he goes up to heaven and he's secure with God, where he's been ascended and reigning from heaven over the earth. And this story in Revelation is not so much about Jesus as it is about the church and the offspring and Jesus' followers who are now on the earth suffering persecution. And lastly, in this story of characters, we have the great red dragon. Does anybody remember? It says that he's the serpent of old. Who would that be? Remember Genesis 3, the Garden of Eden? The serpent, the talking serpent that tempted Eve and Adam to eat the apple and so on. The serpent of old. And in Genesis 3 it says that there's enmity between the woman and the serpent. And one day God is going to crush the head of the serpent. He's going to, wipe out all of that. But the serpent is going to bruise the head. So the devil, the great dragon represents the devil who is at war with God and God's people and God's plans. So this whole chapter about Jesus being born and about the people of God as we live now and as we have always lived shows that the action, if you were going to describe the action in here with a word or two, what would that be? What these characters are all interacting, and how are they interacting? Are they sitting down and having a picnic dinner together? So how would you describe what they're doing? Violent. There's conflict. There's tension, at the very least tension. But there's violence, there's conflict, there's warfare going on. And that's the kind of thing that I believe this is trying to say. Notice, this is interesting. We hardly ever read this in church. But notice that the dragon is trying to devour the child as soon as he's born. Do you remember what happens in Matthew after Jesus is born? One of those things that we don't read too much. What did King Herod try to do? Killed all the babies to try to get rid of the Messiah, and it didn't work. The Messiah escaped. So this vision incorporates some of that the dragon was trying to get at the people of God and get at the Messiah. And it didn't work. The dragon is unsuccessful. He tries to persecute faithful Israel, God's people, tries to flood them out. You know, in the Old Testament, flood is usually a sign. We think, of course, of Noah and the flood, but in general, in the Old Testament, a flood is troubles and trials and tribulations. Psalm 69, 1 and 2 says, you know, the floods have risen up and they're about to overwhelm me. And he's talking about not being caught in a flash flood. He's talking about the troubles of his life have just come up to here and he can't take it anymore. So the dragon is trying to persecute the woman and the woman's followers with this flood. But also in the book of Revelation, what comes out of a person's mouth is usually words, all right? So the person that Jesus is figured as a lot of times is a warrior on a horse with a sword coming out of his mouth. That's an odd thing. It's a good thing we don't take these things absolutely literally. So Jesus has what? The word of God coming out of his mouth. And so what comes out of a person's mouth are their words. The dragon is trying to use his power and his cunning because of his, you know, he's got these 10 heads, was it, or 7 heads? 7. I get confused. 7 heads and 7 crowns. So he's got a lot of wisdom and cunning, and he's got a lot of authority, and he's got power to do all this. So he's trying to use all of that stuff to get at the woman. And in the end, he's unsuccessful with her, and so he's mad, and he goes off to wage war with the rest of the Christians, the rest of the people who follow Jesus. Now, so there's warfare going on. This is an ongoing thing. Notice that Jesus is in heaven, and the woman is safe somewhere, and the devil is just going after all of the followers of Jesus. So there's tension, there's warfare, there's all kinds of bad things happening to Christians in the world because they follow Jesus. Let me read you one last thing before I get to the punchline. See, you're starting to think, is he ever going to get to the end of this? What's the point? All right, we're getting there. We're close to the point now. In 1 John, the first letter of John, chapter 3, verse 8, it says this, the one who practices sin is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. But the Son of God appeared for this purpose, that he might destroy the works of the devil. Part of the reason why Jesus came is to destroy the things that the devil had done to mess up God's plans and God's kingdom in the world. Part of the reason why Jesus came was to destroy the works of the evil one. And as followers of Jesus, we are part of that same struggle to destroy the works of the evil one. We're part of the same struggle that we're in conflict with the evil one as he manifests himself through the powers of the world to kind of mess up God's kingdom and God's plans. And as Christians, we're called to be a part of not letting the devil do that. But so we're engaged in a warfare that's going on. We all, as Christians, are thrown into this struggle. We're born into this struggle. If you're a Christian, you're part of the struggle. And most of us sometimes act as though we don't even know that there's a struggle going on. But there's a warfare, a cosmic warfare happening. Now, I don't want you to press. We're getting really close to the point here now. I don't want you to press that warfare idea too much, because Jesus showed us how we are to live our lives. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a Russian, interred in a gulag for years, and he came out, and he's a Christian, and he spoke at Harvard and just alienated everybody at Harvard when he spoke, because he said, you guys in the West, you think you're so great, but you're not any better than us in Russia with, with Stalin and so on. He says the dividing line, this was the line from that speech at Harvard, the dividing line between good and evil, the battle line between good and evil, does not run between nation and nation, does not run between city and city or ethnic group and ethnic group. The dividing line between good and evil runs down the middle of every human heart. So in the first instance, the struggle that we're called to engage in is the struggle of evil in our own lives. And like I said, I don't want you to press that warfare thing too much, because Jesus and John told us here how we are to fight that struggle. And here it is in verse 11. When the dragon was thrown down to the earth, and Christ has been ascended into heaven and is sitting on the throne with God, it says that they overcame him. In other words, the people of God overcame the red dragon on the earth by a couple of things. The blood of the Lamb. They overcame the devil not because they were smart, not because they lobbied to get the right people elected, not because they lobbied to change the rules and the laws. They overcame because of the blood of the Lamb. Jesus is that sacrificial lamb, and his death on the cross is what gives us the victory. We're already, as God's people, living in the victory that God has given us through Jesus Christ on the cross. So we overcome by the blood of the Lamb, because the blood of the Lamb is what sets us free from that internal struggle, right? The dividing line that runs between good and evil in our own hearts, we can overcome because of what Christ has done. We're forgiven. We don't have to feel guilty anymore. We don't have to feel afraid anymore. We don't have to worry that God is going to cast us out of heaven like he did the red dragon anymore, because of what Jesus did for us. We can be set free from all of that because of our faith in Christ. And so we're set free by the blood of the Lamb. We're set free. We overcome. It says let me read it from verse 11, then I'll switch it over for you. They overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. They talked about their experience of being set free by the blood of the Lamb with other people. They were willing to say what Christ had done for them. And so one of the ways that they overcame in the world, one of the ways that they engaged in the struggle in the world to have the kingdom of God come in its fullness, one of the ways that they engaged in that struggle was simply to tell people about what Christ has done for them. One of the best things that happens in church on Sunday mornings is like sometimes during prayer time. It doesn't happen very often. But one of the best things that happens is where people tell where they have seen Christ at work in their lives. And, we do that before our session meetings. And a lot of times people are like, I forgot. I always forget. Like I'll think of something that happened and I should write that down, and I don't write it down and I forget. But when people do remember and tell somebody, like, God just blessed me by doing this for me. God blessed me by helping me in this way. God blessed me by helping me because I'm one of his children, because of what Jesus has done. And when people tell that, blessing happens. That's engaging in a struggle. because people don't believe that blessing happens like that. People believe that blessing happens when you grab the bull by the horns or your boots by their bootstraps and pull yourself up. They don't believe that blessing just flows from God like an ever-flowing fountain of life that he is. And yet, that's how it happens. And then lastly, they overcome by the blood of the Lamb. They overcome by the word of their testimony, by being willing to share the gospel message and how it's worked in our lives. We don't use swords and bombs and bullets or votes, but the gospel. And then lastly, they overcame because they did not love their own lives even unto death. Remember where Jesus says, he who loves his life will what? Lose it. But he who loses his life for my sake will preserve it. People who have that kind of outlook and mentality because of what God has done for them aren't worried about if people think that they're, weird. They're not worried if people think, well, it's just a coincidence that happened to you. How do you know God? People aren't worried about that. They're not worried about losing status with other people because of their relationship with Christ. What they're concerned with is the blood of the Lamb and the testimony that they can share with other people. And so I just wanted to encourage us this morning. Like I said, I love Christmas. I love Christmas. I love all of the stuff that goes along with it. But let's not forget that Christmas is also the birth of the King into enemy territory. And that Jesus' whole life was part of our overcoming and being able to overcome the sin and the evil that dwells in us. And we overcome because, and this is what they say, a good speech always does. First you tell people what you're going to say, and then you say it, and then you remind them of what you just said, okay? So this is the reminding you part. We overcome by the blood of the Lamb, by what Jesus did for us on the cross. We overcome by our testimony of what Christ has done in our lives and sharing it with other people. And we overcome by being willing to do that, even to the point of diminishing our own life. I'm not talking about dying. It might come to that. You might be called to be a missionary and die on a beach somewhere. That'd be okay. But all those little daily deaths that we undergo because of our testimony for Jesus, those are the kinds of things that we're called to die for. Let's close in a word of prayer.